He's been secretly saving for his own funeral so his kids never have to pay. There is a bank account many older men maintain that their families don't know exists, a modest sum set aside quietly over years, sometimes decades, earmarked for a single specific purpose that most people never think to plan for this far in advance: his own funeral. No dramatic announcement accompanies its creation. No family meeting discusses its existence. He simply opens it, deposits into it periodically, and continues carrying the same weight he's carried his entire life, extended now, quietly, past the boundary of his own death. The wise observer has encountered this particular pattern with real tenderness because it represents perhaps the most extreme, the most poignant extension of a psychological orientation discussed throughout so much of this channel's exploration of Gen X masculinity, the deeply held conviction that his fundamental role is to provide, to protect, to ensure no one he loves ever bears an unnecessary burden because of him. Most expressions of this pattern end, naturally, with his own life. This particular expression doesn't. It extends the provider identity past the single boundary that should, by any reasonable logic, finally release him from the obligation, his own death. To understand why a man would spend years quietly saving for an expense he'll never personally experience, the wise observer must look at what funeral costs actually represent to families navigating grief in real time. Many men of this generation have witnessed, directly or through stories passed down from their own parents' generation, the genuine financial strain that unexpected funeral expenses can place on grieving families, thousands of dollars required at precisely the moment when grief makes clear thinking and financial planning almost impossible. Having witnessed this strain, either personally or through family history, many of these men make a quiet, private vow: whatever else happens, his own death will not become one more financial burden layered on top of the emotional devastation his family will already be carrying. Consider what this actually looks like in practice, the specific mechanics of this quiet, decades-long project. A modest amount transferred into a separate savings account each month, small enough not to noticeably affect the household budget, consistent enough to accumulate meaningfully over years. Perhaps a prepaid funeral plan purchased directly through a funeral home, locking in current prices against future inflation, sometimes selected and arranged entirely without his spouse's knowledge, details worked out during a lunch break, or a quiet weekday errand explained away as something else entirely. The specific plot, the specific casket, sometimes even the specific songs for the service, all decided and paid for years in advance, waiting patiently for a day he hopes remains as distant as possible. The wise observer wants to name something important here. This planning isn't morbid preoccupation with death in the way it might initially appear to someone unfamiliar with the psychology driving it. For the man engaged in this quiet preparation, it functions as one final concrete act of care he can perform for his family. One more item on a lifelong list of practical ways he's demonstrated love through provision rather than words. The funeral fund isn't really about death. It's about ensuring that even his absence, even the worst day his family will eventually face, arrives with one less thing for them to worry about. There's a particular scene worth picturing that captures this pattern with real emotional resonance. A man sits alone at a kitchen table, reviewing a prepaid funeral contract he's kept folded inside a manila envelope for years, checking periodically to ensure the paperwork remains current and the arrangements still align with his wishes. He does this quietly, usually when his wife is out running errands, treating this particular piece of planning with the same private, methodical care he brings to reviewing insurance policies or checking the oil in his car, a routine maintenance task, rather than an emotionally fraught confrontation with his own mortality, even though, viewed from the outside, it's clearly both. This pattern often intensifies specifically following the death of his own parents, when he directly experiences, often for the first time, the actual financial and logistical burden that funeral arrangements place on grieving adult children. Having navigated his own parents' funeral costs, sometimes discovering unexpected expenses at precisely the moment his own grief made careful financial decision-making nearly impossible, many men emerge from this experience with a newly urgent determination that his own children will never face that same compounded burden. The funeral planning that follows isn't abstract anymore. It's informed by direct, recent, painful, first-hand knowledge of exactly what he's trying to prevent. It's worth examining how this pattern intersects with his broader difficulty discussing mortality directly with his family, a topic explored elsewhere in this channel's examination of emotional avoidance. Many men who maintain this secret fund would struggle enormously to have an explicit, direct conversation with their children about death, about end-of-life wishes, about what happens when he's gone. The funeral fund itself becomes a kind of substitute for that difficult conversation action taken quietly and privately, precisely because verbal disclosure of his own mortality planning feels considerably more emotionally exposing than simply handling the practical logistics without ever mentioning them at all. The wise observer wants to point out something particularly poignant about how this secret sometimes gets discovered, usually only after his actual death. When adult children going through his financial records encounter a fund or prepaid contract they never knew existed, this discovery often produces a specific, complicated grief response distinct from the immediate loss itself, a delayed recognition of exactly how much quiet, ongoing care their father had been providing without ever once mentioning it. Spanning years or even decades of private preparation, they never had the chance to properly acknowledge or thank him for while he was still alive to receive that gratitude. There's a specific tenderness worth naming in how some families do discover this planning while he's still living, usually by accident rather than through his own voluntary disclosure. A wife going through paperwork for an entirely unrelated purpose, an adult child helping organize important documents during a health scare, might stumble upon evidence of this secret fund and experience a profound, immediate shift in how they understand him. The discovery often produces not confusion or discomfort, but a deep, aching tenderness, recognition of a love expressed so quietly, so completely without expectation of acknowledgement, that it had remained entirely hidden until circumstance revealed it. It's worth noting how this pattern occasionally produces genuine tension within families once discovered, particularly regarding communication and shared decision-making around end-of-life planning more broadly. Some family members, upon learning about the secret fund, express genuine hurt that such significant planning occurred without any consultation or shared conversation, feeling that even well-intentioned secrecy around something this significant represents a missed opportunity for genuine partnership and open communication about mortality that the family could have navigated together rather than separately. This tension, when it arises, deserves honest acknowledgement rather than simple dismissal in favor of celebrating the sentiment alone. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge the specific comfort many of these men describe experiencing once the planning is actually complete, a peace that goes beyond simple financial preparation. There's something genuinely stabilizing about having addressed, concretely and completely, one of the few remaining practical burdens his eventual death will place on his family. For a man whose entire identity has been organized around minimizing the weight he places on others, completing this particular preparation often represents a final, the significant item successfully checked off a lifetime list of provider responsibilities, offering a specific kind of peace that purely emotional processing of mortality alone rarely provides. There's a particular irony worth naming in how this pattern sometimes coexists alongside genuine financial anxiety in other areas of his life. A man who carefully, consistently sets aside funds for his own funeral might simultaneously struggle with retirement savings, might avoid necessary medical expenses for himself, might delay his own comfort or care in ways that seem to contradict the careful financial planning evident in his funeral fund. This apparent contradiction actually reveals something consistent rather than confused. His own present-day comfort and well-being rank considerably lower in his internal priority system than his family's future, freedom from burden, even burden that technically won't arrive until after his death. It's worth examining how this pattern shows up specifically in men who experienced genuine financial hardship during their own parents' funeral arrangements, a formative experience that often crystallizes this particular planning into concrete, immediate action rather than vague future intention. A man who watched his own mother struggle to cover his father's unexpected funeral costs, perhaps taking on debt during an already devastating period of grief, often describes the specific moment this experience transformed from abstract sympathy into personal determination. Watching a parent's grief compounded by financial stress creates a visceral, unforgettable understanding of exactly what he's determined to prevent for his own children, informing every subsequent decision about his own end-of-life financial preparation. There's a specific scene worth picturing that illustrates how this secret sometimes finally comes to light through circumstances he never anticipated or planned for. During a serious health scare, perhaps a diagnosis requiring him to organize his affairs more formally than he'd previously needed to, his wife discovers the prepaid funeral contract while helping him locate other important documents. Her reaction surprises him, not the discomfort or morbid unease he'd always feared, but a quiet, overwhelming tenderness, tears forming, as she realizes exactly how long he's been quietly protecting her from a burden she never knew he'd already solved. The wise observer wants to point out something specific about how adult children often respond upon eventually learning about this planning, a response that frequently differs meaningfully by generation and by how openly the family has otherwise discussed death and mortality throughout their lives together. Adult children, raised in families where death remained largely undiscussed, often describe genuine shock alongside their gratitude, a jarring confrontation with their father's mortality planning that feels disconnected from how the family has otherwise related to conversations about aging and eventual loss. Adult children from families with more open communication patterns around mortality tend to receive the news with less shock, sometimes even having half suspected such planning existed, given their father's broader patterns of quiet, protective preparation throughout their lives. It's worth noting, too, how this specific form of preparation sometimes extends beyond funeral costs alone into broader categories of what might be called anticipatory grief management. Pre-written obituaries, reviewed and approved years in advance. Specific instructions about which family photographs should be displayed at the service. Sometimes even letters written to be opened by specific family members after his death, containing sentiments he could never quite manage to express directly while alive. These additional preparations reveal the same underlying pattern extended further, using concrete, practical action as a substitute for the emotional vulnerability that direct conversation about death and final wishes would otherwise require. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge how this pattern occasionally produces its own particular form of dark humor within families once disclosed and processed, humor that coexists comfortably alongside the genuine tenderness the discovery initially produces. Adult children sometimes describe affectionately teasing their father about his meticulous funeral planning, finding in this humor a way of processing eventual loss that feels lighter than avoiding the topic out of discomfort. This humor doesn't diminish the underlying tenderness. It becomes another genuine form of connection, built directly on top of the vulnerability his disclosure finally allowed. Of what this pattern also represents. A man who never fully learned that love could include vulnerability, that being cared for wasn't itself a burden he needed to preemptively solve. The funeral fund is beautiful evidence of enduring care. It's also, in its own quiet way, evidence of a man still unable to simply say the words, "I'm scared of dying and worried about leaving you with too much to handle," choosing instead to solve that fear through action rather than through the harder, more exposing path of shared conversation. The wise observer's closing thought is this: if you discover, during your father's life or after it, evidence of this kind of quiet preparation, understand that it represents one of the purest expressions of a lifetime spent providing rather than speaking, protecting rather than disclosing. The most valuable response isn't simply gratitude for the practical gift, meaningful as that gift genuinely is, but also recognition of the harder gift he never quite learned how to offer. The vulnerability of simply telling you, directly, that he loves you enough to be afraid of leaving you burdened and to let you love him back through that fear, rather than needing to solve it entirely alone.